Thank you. Thank you all for being here. And I mean, thank you all for being here, but I especially love those of you who've allowed your camera to see me because then I can see your faces, and that's very sweet. Now I can see you smile and see the questions in your eyes. So that's really nice. All of you know that books, if they're written by one person, but a book only has life if people read it. And it only has life if people think about the ideas and make it a part of their lives. So, I'm really grateful to have this opportunity to talk with you and to bring you into the community of people who maybe will help this book come alive. I think Americans, it's interesting to me. I'd like to talk first about why I wrote the book and, what I think some of its key ideas are, and then kind of you know, we'll take a milk run through the chapters of it. But I think Americans, we're very proud in many ways of the rights that women have in our country. We question, are they enough, or are we walking backwards? But regardless, if we think of the contrast between our lives as women and men, we're proud, and we are horrified when we think of what's happening, for example, to women in Afghanistan who've just had the right to going to high school taken away from them, no education above sixth grade, who can't go out of their homes unless they're given permission by their husbands, who can't vote, of course, who can't do so many things, who don't really have, rights to their own lives. And yet that's not a bad description of America in 1776. The state of rights of women in our country when our country was founded. And so I like to think that this is something of which we can take real pride. And I think we do take real pride as Americans. And so it's funny to me that so many Americans still balk at the word feminism. And we think, well, I'm a feminist. I support gender equality, but. And so this book, I wrote it because I was prompted in part, there are other things going on too, but that there's a kind of mythology, which I think is not helpful to us, especially right now when Americans wonder what values we still hold in common. There's a sense, of course, of division in the country. And we wonder, well, what about, I thought we were all on board with certain things. And so I think one thing that helps us in a time like this is to think about what things we're all on board with, so that we can value those common values and defend them and make sure that we are living by them and take pride in them, because that's just a good feeling. And nothing wrong with having a good feeling about what we're doing as a people. So I'd like to talk about kind of the two myths that I think that have grown up around feminism. The purpose of the book is to document the reality. So the myths are, I think there's a myth on the left that feminism, and you'll hear this at different times depending on which newspapers you read, but that feminism is racist or transphobic or just old-fashioned. That's kind of your mom's Buick or something. And that's kind of on the left. And then on the right, the other myth that floats around is that feminism is anti-family or anti-man, or just kind of a cranky group of nutty, cranky people. Both of these myths are so untrue in terms of the historical record that I think it's just really important for us to get straight on that. Now, by the way, it's true in any large group of people that you will find people with both who fit either of those descriptions, because that's the way life is. I always like to think of it as like, there are people who make Christmas look bad. So that's not how you judge Christmas. You judge Christmas by, what it is. So anyway, so I felt it was time to sort of document the reality of this. And then I think the other thing that happens sometimes when we talk about feminism or women's rights or women's history, if you will, is that there's this idea that it's kind of like this, like specialty food item. It's something you put on the plate after you've got the meat and potatoes on there or whatever, salmon and farro, depending on your more modernization. It's like it's a supplement. But the fact is that feminism was born in the American Revolution. Was part of the American Revolution and spread outward from there to France and to England. And it has driven American history in substantial ways. There have been other drivers as well, but the quest for gender equality and for women's rights in particular has really shaped such things as industrialization, the abolition of slavery, the creation of a social safety net that I venture to say everyone in this room has benefited from. And so we can pretend to tell the story of these, major moments in American history, the Industrial Revolution or whatever, and we can talk about it without talking about feminism, but that really means that we're robbing ourselves of some of the most interesting and precious parts of those stories. So I like to think of this as being not only setting straight the record on, well, what the heck is feminism, but also how can we better understand it as a part of American history and therefore understand all of American history better. Now, I say this, I'm not, most of my work as a scholar has not been on women's rights. It's this, I've always been interested in this topic, have some personal history with that topic, but I've written on American history generally. And so I think that gives me some context for saying, no, this is not a specialty thing. This is really part of the, what constitutes US history. So why is that? How is feminism born in the American Revolution? And by the way, I know this is a group of scholars, so I realize you are probably going to have questions. You might have already had questions. So I have actually opened my chat box. And if you go down to the bottom of your screen, there's the chat little function. You could open that up. And then if the moment moves, you write something down and I'll see the question. I might not stop to answer it, but at the end, I'll know what they are and I can, come back to them, dip back into that, to that moment, if you will. And that way you don't forget something you might have wanted to ask. So, how can you say that that this is central to the American Revolution, that this comes so logically, so fully from the American Revolution? I think, first of all, we need to understand the American Revolution itself as a little differently. I know these are scholars out there, so I can say names like John Locke, and you're not going to get completely flummoxed. Some of you will, of course. But, that's a pretty famous name, John Locke, the British philosopher. And Locke's, who many historians will say, okay, if you want to understand the Declaration of Independence, the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, that's just a quote, modified slightly from John Locke, which was life, liberty, and property. The idea that our government has to be able to defend our lives, our liberty, and our property. And if it can't do that, then we have a right to change the government. And that was the original justification for, rule of, for, and by the people, modified slightly because it's a constitutional monarchy in England. But in 1688, when John Locke wrote the two treatises of government, he was setting the stage for Thomas Jefferson and George Washington and John Adams et al., Alexander Hamilton. So why is that important to this conversation? You would say, well, wait a minute, hello, how do we get off on that tangent? Well, it's important to understand that the John Locke, he wrote, some of you will recognize this, what that comes from, that phrasing, comes from the two treatises of government. Now, most of what we talk about, we generally are quoting the second of these two treatises. There was a first. If there are two treatises, there is also the first one. The first one, the entire point of the first treatise, which laid the basis, which gave him a launching pad for talking about government of, for, and by the people, life, liberty, and property. The basis of that was a disquisition on why patriarchy is a foolish way to set up government. And he was literally specifically criticizing a book that was called Patriarcha. And Patriarcha was, at that time, this sort of, fullest explanation for the divine theory of government. Why kings, a man above all other men, their father, if you will, this government by a man who's the father of his country, the father of everybody else. This was from Patriarcha. And Patriarcha was, written by an earlier philosopher in England, and essentially it was the idea that kings are the fathers of their countries, and that they derive their powers literally from Adam, as in Adam and Eve, that Adam, And Adam and his children has his children's children, these men, lineal descendants of Adam, ultimately became the heads of government around the world. And so if you try, this is why the royal blood is literally, literally like royal blood, holy, a divine characteristic. And essentially, Filmer was the name of that author, not really remembered much, but Filmer was saying that the men beneath them, they were children. Like, they didn't want, and they didn't even need, they certainly didn't need, and most of them didn't even want power over major decisions, because that's what God gives us. That's what our Father tells us. And so the idea was that within, and Filmer, extrapolated from that God the Father shared with, the male non-lineal descendants of Adam, that they were like the kings of their households, and that their children, their people under them were the women and the servants and slaves, etc. And of course, children, actual children. So it was John Locke's belief that this was a pernicious notion, that patriarchy was essentially an argument for keeping all of humanity enslaved, and that no one man had a right to rule all other men. And so, of course, we won't go into English history, but that led to a series of softenings of the monarchical system. And in the United States, what that led to was a full-scale rebellion against patriarchy. And that full-scale rebellion was led by white men who were the first critics of patriarchy. Everybody talks about the patriarchy today. Well, the patriarchy was George III, King of England and King of the colonies. And so when that system was questioned so thoroughly during the American Revolution by people like John Adams, and John Adams, if you've read any Joseph Ellis, raise your hands if you love Joseph Ellis. Yes, we're not worthy. I love Joseph Ellis. Anyway, and Ellis is one among many scholars who would say, the Adams household is in, Quincy, Massachusetts, and they had a home in Boston too, but it's kind of ground zero for the American Revolution. That sort of organizational acumen of the American Revolution really comes from a number of people, but John Adams is a really central character in why the United States, they band together and declare independence. So in the Adams household, the idea that one person should not rule another, that all men, might include women too, and that they're born equal and therefore entitled by their creator with certain inalienable rights, including life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, the American version of property. That was an idea that Abigail Adams took up. So if you've read anything about the history of women's rights, at some moment or other, you're going to come across the phrase, remember the ladies. And I just nod, any nods, any head nods, remember the ladies. Well, okay, I see one. I'm taking that as good evidence that it's not totally new territory here. So famously, Abigail Adams wrote to her husband in early May of 1776, 2 months before the Declaration of Independence. And she wrote, several things, this is how the chickens are doing, et cetera, keeping them up to date on basic stuff. And she raised a couple questions. She said, I'm concerned about the southern states. Will they fight as hard as we are here in New England? Because, they're used to taking men's liberty away from them. And she said, Black men have as much right to liberty as we do. And she also said, when are we going to get around to signing that Declaration of Independence? Isn't it time? So she, she had a number of things she raised. But in the heart of that letter, she wrote, all men would be tyrants if they could. And she's basically raising what's very familiar to them both, which is this anti-patriarchal argument. Don't give one man the power over all other men because he's the patriarch, because all men would be tyrants if they could. And she said, so remember the ladies when you're writing the laws, and don't change the laws, which now make us, I'm paraphrasing, but I'm mixing in some of her words. She said, that make us the vassals of your sex. Vassals meaning, serfs or slaves or underlings. And she says, because some don't give men the power to abuse us with impunity, as the laws do now, with impunity. And she, by the way, she, being a good wife, being in love with her husband, she says, no, all men are not this way. Of course, we all know that. She knows that. But what's the point of law? The point of law is that not all men are angels. If we are all angels, who needs laws, right? We'll just, naturally good. But law is meant to protect not the powerful, but the powerless. And so she says, we don't have a voice in government, so can you please rewrite these laws? And so mostly that's what people mostly remember, is that she said, remember the ladies. What a lot of people don't remember, and this is, of course, now we're on the chase here, because my book is about, talking about these personal and intimate relationships and how people negotiate these like really profound questions. They're not just out there, they're actually here, they affect our own lives. And so she writes this to John. Now, he writes her back. It's almost a month before the letter gets back from Philadelphia, et cetera. It's wartime. And he, like she, starts out, with other topics, and he answers her as he always does, very direct, very, yes, he knows she knows all the issues. She's following them too. He writes her back, what's going on with the logistics and what about the Southerners and what they're doing, how they're handling things. Then he comes to the meat of her letter and he says, I cannot but laugh. And then he goes on to, petticoat government and poor George Washington. Is he going to have to fight off a race of Amazons now? And then he sort of questions her loyalty. He says, the enemy is trying to stir up discontent. And now women? So he makes it into a joke, and then he makes it into kind of a test of her loyalty, and then he kind of moves on. So it's an interesting set of correspondence, and there are other parts of it that I explore too in my book. So it's fun to just watch how this married couple, who are deeply in love, work together and, conflict over this really important argument. But I thought it was so interesting that a month after he wrote Abigail, this kind of dismissive, poo-pooing, ha-ha, kind of a little sarcastic, a little snarky, a little, tweaking her, he writes to another man, a legislator from Massachusetts. And this guy is writing, the other fellow is writing John Adams, saying, we're thinking about how far to expand the franchise because, should men who don't have property be able to vote? And of course, that is the first great innovation, is the idea that white men of property without property could vote. And so John Adams writes him back and says, well, yes, but be careful how far you take this. He said, because depend upon it, sir, women will ask for the vote. So 150 years before women get the vote in America, a critical founder of the American Revolution is warning that this revolution, taken too far, will lead to possibly chaos and women's rights. So this idea that women's rights are, part of this American Revolution, and I think it helps us to explain a little bit why. And this is just a sort of broader dynamic I'll say a few moments, say something about, which is, why is it that almost every innovation in women's rights has been opposed quite strenuously at the time? And as I said, the vote, it takes 150 years. It takes 70 years of active lobbying, but a long time. So you get it, whatever things like being able to wear pants. Okay, that was strenuously opposed at the time. But today, like I'm sitting here in pants, by the way, wearing long trousers. And after a right comes in, there's a tendency to go, oh, well, yeah, of course, I don't even know why you're even bringing that up again, because it's old hat. And I think that the reason why women's rights tend to become old hat right away, almost the very next generation doesn't even think twice about some new right that's been extended. Like the right to birth control is new, 1965. So abortion, 1972, now in question. But for some people, so is birth control, which is also new, 1965, so not long before that. But, nevertheless, most people today would say, well, why would birth control ever be illegal? And that's partly because every time a new right has been extended, it seems there's a kind of a natural fit. And the natural fit goes back to this idea that all men and women are created equal and endowed by their creator with the right to equal dignity, equal opportunity, equality before the law, and that kind of thing. And so it's this sort of underlying subterranean logic that it goes back very far, really, to John Locke, that helps to explain it. So now what I'd like to do before anybody knocks off altogether is I want to share my screen and just give you a sense of the outline of the book and leave a little time for questions. And it's a Saturday afternoon and I'm in Ohio, so it's even later here. But I'd like to give you just a sense of what the book's about. So it's a new book. It just came out about a month ago, actually. And this is the fourth book I've written for Harvard University Press. And as I said, we talked about American Empire another time. You notice that the subtitle is Feminist Patriots, from Abigail Adams to Beyonce. So I've had people say, well, wait, first of all, how can you put those two words together, right? Feminism is a left word and patriotism is a right word on the right. And so you can't like jam them together. And I just take, by the way, my definition of feminism from the definition that was given by Eleanor Roosevelt, First Lady, married to FDR, in 1935. She was a feminist and she was trying to explain what feminism is. And now I'm going to paraphrase because I don't have my own book in front of me, but she said, feminism is simply the belief that all citizens, including women, are entitled to the same rights under the law. Something like as basic as that. So that's 1935. Patriotism, I'm taking as meaning the sort of Oxford OED definition, which is essentially patriotism. This is not a game of capture the flag. It's that, if you are a person willing to defend the values of your country, and that's how the Oxford English Dictionary has defined it, going back to 1500s, that makes you a patriot. And I think my argument throughout this book is that these feminist patriots have really advanced the American dream from the beginning, have made an argument as to what America is. So the book starts with Abigail Adams, and essentially the structure of the book is there are 8 chapters, and 8 chapters, each chapter does 2 things. First of all, it tells a story about 2 different women. I begin with 2 women who are both named Abigail, although I only have a picture of one because the other one there are no likenesses that have come down to us. And each chapter tells about one woman who's kind of the face of feminism, and that's, in this case, Abigail Adams, a person who was a kind of civic-minded person whose own life often was great. I mean, in the context of her time, Abigail Adams had a beautiful life, and she knew it, never complained about it at all. But she could sort of look upon other people's lives and say, well, that's something we all need to do something about. So the first person in each chapter, who's my face of feminism, if you will, is a person who is civic-minded and who felt that things needed to change, not necessarily even for themselves, but certainly for others. I mean, I know there are many of you like that today. You might give to a certain charity, or you might be involved in a certain kind of thing. Even your life isn't touched by homelessness, but you want to help people who are homeless. And then the second person in each chapter is a person who I call the why we care person. The person whose life, whose life is such that we would all go, oh my gosh, I had no idea. That if you didn't have certain rights, again, rights are for people whose lives express extreme hardship. And we say, the law should be watching out for people who could be vulnerable to a certain kind of abuse if they didn't have rights. So this is, again, not meant for kings and queens. It's meant for people, average people. So each chapter features a second person who's the why we care, why anybody cared at the time, why laws began to change. The other thing that each chapter does is it explains how, in this sort of generational way, that across these kind of 8 generations, if you will, that women kind of climbed a ladder of rights, a ladder that puts us where we are today. And so with Abigail Adams' generation, it was the right to learn. Abigail was herself a very big advocate for girls' education. What is meant by that is essentially what people are talking about in Afghanistan today. Girls could go to elementary schools in the colonial era when they were available. Girls and boys went to them, but only boys went beyond elementary education, as in Afghanistan today. And it was Abigail Adams who was one of the first people to raise this question of why aren't girls Don't they have brains? Why can't we allow them to go past this very elementary, 3 R's? And so the book talks a lot about that sort of story. And what's really remarkable is that an outcome of the American Revolution, an outcome which is rarely spoken of, but a very important outcome, was the right for girls to get higher education, meaning secondary education. And so the very first, what they called them at that time, ladies' academies. The first ladies' academy was founded in 1787 during the same summertime, just 3 or 4 blocks away from Independence Hall, when the men of the American Revolution were writing up the US Constitution. And so while the US Constitution is being written up, another group of men, and some of the same men, including people like Benjamin Rush, close friend of Jefferson and Adams and Surgeon General of the Continental Army during the Revolutionary War, he was one of the founders of the first Ladies' Academy. And it was Abigail Adams and John who were great supporters of this movement. And Abigail was one of the first people to say, we need to let girls go to school. Now, why does that become important? And you might say, well, what's the fuss about? Okay, yeah, you know more geography than you did. It's important because it's the only way we can explain one of the important parts, anyway, of the explanation for the Industrial Revolution. Economists, if you look at it, read your economics books, and one thing they'll say is it's the creation of a literate working class, men and women who can read and write and do their numbers, which allows a country to industrialize. And so the foundation of the Industrial Revolution is the creation of a large literate mass of people. Well, how you do that? You do that by letting girls go to high school and they become school teachers. And then they spread out across the West, across the Northeast, across the South, less in the South, which is the less well-educated part of the country for many years. And this is what helps to create the basis. And Abigail, by the way, was one of the first to say that. John wrote her another letter saying, oh, we really need to improve education in New England or America will never have great inventors. Abigail never wanted to miss an opportunity, wrote back and said, yes, well, it would be important for us to educate the girls too, because then they can become school teachers and they can educate this next generation. So she saw it. It was right at the heart of the entire American Revolution. And so I'm moving on. I'm not going to show you the picture of my other Abigail. Actually, let me back up. I will tell you, just Abigail Bailey is the other person in this chapter. She is a woman who had 17 children. Her husband had sole custody of their children. Why? Because all husbands had sole custody of their children. Mothers had no custody of their own children. If you gave a man a son, you really actually gave him your son. And that man, in her case, turned out to be a sexual predator and harmed their daughter and harmed their sons also by farming them out for money. And she had no rights, but she prevails. Oh, so it's an exciting story. She gets on a horse, she travels 200 miles through the snow and ice. And anyway, it's really true. And it's all a true story. And that's the story. Why did laws which gave women and mothers and married women zero rights, in fact, no identity in the law? They were considered to have no separate identity from their husbands. They couldn't even commit a crime. I know, because they were considered to be acting on their husband's behalf. Very weird setup. Anyway, chapter 2, My Face of Feminism, is this woman, Angelina Grimke. I know it's not a good picture. She looks her name is Grimke, and she looks kind of grim, right? But whatever, 19th century lithograph. She was actually considered, I guess, very, very charming, very extremely charismatic. And she and her sister, Sarah Grimke, were early feminists and articulated. In fact, her sister wrote Letters on the Emancipation of Women, or something. I'm forgetting the exact title now. But what they advocated for was the right to speak. So under Abigail Adams' time, it emerged that women had the right to learn, but women still had no right to speak in public. Now, you think that's I'm possibly exaggerating that? I always feel like these things are so crazy. We're like, oh, she must be exaggerating that one. John Adams wrote his wife about John Hancock's new wife, who I think his name was Dolly. And he said, oh, I just love John Hancock's, she's such a marvelous person, this woman he married, and she doesn't speak in public, as we all know a woman should do. She never opens her lips. he writes that back, I mean, in all seriousness, because a woman is supposed to speak only with her eyes. So imagine this Zoom conference if all I did was this. That's called a woman speaking. So anyhow, so Angeline Kripke advocated the right that women should be able to speak in public. And why? I mean, largely at the time, because she said slavery is so horrible that it is our job. We are citizens. And when people would say, well, women can't do that, she'd say, aren't we citizens? Have women no country? Aren't women part of the country? So she sort of kind of backs into this defense of women's rights. But it starts with the rights of enslaved Black people. The Why We Care person in that chapter, because Angelina Kripke, by the way, came from great wealth, which, by the way, she turned her back on because it was all based on slavery. She turned her back and walked into a life of poverty. But she walked into that life partly to defend women like this. And this is Harriet Jacobs, who was an enslaved woman and wrote one of the most important memoirs, in fact, the only memoir we have, of slavery from a woman's point of view. Because from a woman's point of view, it's quite different from a man's point of view. After 1808, it wasn't legal to bring slaves in from abroad anymore, the ban on the importation of slaves from Africa after 1808. So the only way that you could have a new generation of slaves was through the wombs, the uteruses of enslaved American women. And she was one of those women who said, I know there's many things I have to do as an enslaved person I don't want to do, but this is one line she wasn't going to cross. And it's a fascinating story. She is the American Anne Frank. And if don't know about Harriet Jacobs, get her book or read my book, which will condense her book. But it's the life of a slave girl, and a wonderful memoir. And she hides in a garret like Anne Frank, but not for 2 years, for 7 years. When she gets out, she can hardly bend her arms and her legs. She can hardly walk, but she does. She flees slavery. She saves her children. She had children. Anyway, just a marvelous story. And hers is the kind of why we care. Why do we care that women should be able to speak out on behalf of important issues like the abolition of slavery? We care. And this kind of woman helped us to care. And she also spoke. She spoke up, which was that second right that women won. And my third chapter, I talk about the right to lobby. And so I don't want to belabor any of this. This is Susan B. Anthony. Yes, this is younger Susan B. Anthony, who was known first and above all as an abolitionist. And this gets to the myth that feminism is a group of racists. And very even people have said, oh, Susan B. Anthony was racist because she said this or that. It's because of Susan B. Anthony, to an important extent, that we have the 13th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution. Now, you might be going, wait, 13th, one was that? 13th was the one abolishing slavery. And it was Susan B. Anthony who organized and staffed a nationwide petition campaign. And those petitions were taken into the U.S. Senate in order to put the 13th Amendment on the floor, to introduce it as a bill in the United States Congress. So the right to lobby, people often associate Susan B. Anthony with the right to vote, but it comes well after her death. Of course, she is an important advocate for that right, but the idea that women should be out there lobbying government and changing government is something that Susan B. Anthony really establishes, along with this woman who's the why we care. Because Susan B. Anthony had, basically a good life. She didn't need these rights for herself. She needed them in order to be the kind of citizen she wanted to be and to allow other women to be. So this woman, next woman, the kind of why we care person is Elizabeth Packard. And one of the rights that men had at this time was to right to commit their wives to an insane asylum if they just felt like it. So, we've all heard the jokes about my crazy wife, right? Oh, my wife is crazy, take my wife. Any young men kind of jokes. And in this case, take my wife really meant like, yeah, just take her. And so this Elizabeth Packard was committed by her husband, which a husband could just do by saying to the superintendent of a facility, who of course has a self-interest in admitting somebody, and say, well, my wife's crazy. And she could be put away for life on his one word. And so she was put away. And so my book looks at, oh my God, how did she get out? What was it like? The torture treatments, and it's ghastly. It really is ghastly. She does get herself out. She becomes a lobbyist. A lobbyist for these rights. And in fact, the series of bills that defending the rights of mental patients the first laws to defend the rights of mental patients, such things as the right to receive correspondence, the right to correspond with an attorney. These are things that Elizabeth Packard gets through. And one of the people who's one of the great beneficiaries of this is, of all people, Mary Todd Lincoln. Because when Abraham Lincoln was killed, of course, by this time, Mary Todd Lincoln had also lost her two youngest children. Her two young boys had died of disease, husband assassinated. And her oldest son felt she was not handling this correctly and put her away, because now he was her ward, if you will. And it was only because the laws that Elizabeth Packard passed, lobbied for, that Mary Todd Lincoln was able to challenge this. She was able to get an attorney, and she was able to get out of the insane asylum into which she had been put, and was able to live out the rest of her life with her sister at home. And, if you think of it as, think of what Abraham Lincoln would have felt, would have fought if he had known, and that this was something that this feminist got for this woman who was so dear to him. So in coming chapters, I don't want to go into each one at any length, so that just gives you a sense of how it works. Each chapter being somebody who's kind of a political figure, often a very public figure who's concerned about human rights in general, but also because of this, also very concerned about women's rights. The next face of feminism who takes us into the suffrage era is Mary Church Terrell, a Black suffragist who was very, very important part of the women's suffrage movement, a spokesperson internationally for U.S. feminists. There was a famous Berlin conference in 1904, and the speech that brought down the house in the Berlin Philharmonic, the American speaker who led the American contingent was this Black woman, Mary Church Terrell, and who was, by the way, a protege of Susan B. Anthony. In the next chapter, she's the face of feminism, and in this particular chapter, the Why We Care is an immigrant woman, an Italian immigrant named Rosa Cavalieri, who you see there. And so it explores the issues of what was it like to come from the old world? What did it mean to be not just a woman, but like an American woman? And so Rosa Cavalieri is the kind of the face of why reproductive rights becomes an issue for feminists. And this is the era of Margaret Sanger, which I talk about in that book. Why do women start talking about such things as contraception, and stories, which I won't go into, but stories of women like Rosa Cavalieri are a part of that story. So that's part of the fun. When you write a book, as you all know, you're scholars, you get to pick what you want. And so I really wanted to see the different faces of America, the people who came off the boat, and the women whose families had been brought over from Africa, and the folks who were from the Pilgrims. And so you get this sense of the rich texture and tapestry of American life. In the next chapter, I'm looking at the right to earn. Now, there's a long period of time. It's not until like early 20th century that if a woman earned wages, she got to keep them. They became what? Her property. Because previously, if a woman earned wages, that just meant her husband had more money. And so in fact, there was one of the turning points was some states, state by state, passed the law that women could keep their wages. Even then, to give you an example, in New York, the courts often, this isn't this funny for our times, the courts were often more conservative than the legislatures. So the courts in New York ruled that, well, of course, a woman can keep her wages, if her husband gives his permission. So when is a right and when is a privilege? Because if you're a nice woman, if you're good to your husband, then he'll give you the privilege of keeping your wages. So it's not really a right, it's just a privilege. Anyway, so this chapter focuses on the period of the Great Depression and World War II, and this is Frances Perkins. Frances Perkins was the first woman to ever sit in a presidential cabinet. She was the appointee of Franklin Delano Roosevelt, a good friend of the Roosevelt family, Eleanor, et cetera. And it's because of her. If you've ever worked for minimum wage, that's me. If you have ever, drawn Social Security, not yet, but real close. If you've ever collected unemployment insurance, guilty again, then the person you have to thank for this is Frances Perkins. And by this, I mean that she did not want this job, and she told FDR, "I don't want this job." And he said, Frances, you're the one I want. I want you to take this job. And she says, "Okay, well, I'll only take this job if you let me work towards three things. I'm going to advocate unemployment insurance, a minimum wage, and I want some sort of social safety system for senior citizens so they have a retirement. And he said, Frances, I have no idea if that's possible. In fact, it's probably not. But go for it. Yeah, absolutely. If those are your conditions, I will support you in this. I just don't know how you'll pull that rabbit out of the hat. And she did. And it's all of America has to be grateful to this woman. And again, she was a suffragist. This came out of her values having to do with the rights of women. And she always recognized that women were kind of at the bottom of the heap in terms of employment security. The other person she's paired with, the Why We Care woman, is this lovely cowgirl. And I think it's so much fun, isn't it? So she's from North Dakota. So this is not just, East Coast, one corner of the country. And what she really wanted, this is the Great Depression. She wanted to keep her wages, but she knew if she married, she'd be fired because that was the custom. She was a school teacher, and schools had told her, if you get married, we'll fire you. Now, she wanted that independence. She wanted to stand her. She was a real pioneer type. By God, she rope a steer and bake a pie and sew an apron and teach a class. I mean, she just sort of could do that. And she had many, many marriage proposals, at least 7 that I counted in my research. But she just wanted her independence. She wanted to feel the wind in her face, and so the chapter is really all about that struggle and her back and forth and her just love of the wild. But is she going to get married? Is she not going to get married? And what happens? So her right to earn her own money is really at the heart of that chapter. The next chapters really deal with the second wave of feminism, and my face of feminism is not the probably expected Gloria Steinem or Betty Friedan or someone like that. I mean, I think what's remarkable about feminism and how it's become this wide American value. It's a value that that we really see across our country, and it's not one population group. It's not just white women. I'm sure I went up there. I didn't meet you. This is the woman. Her name is Martha Kotera. She's actually still living. She's a political force in Texas. She was a great friend of Lady Bird Johnson and knew Ann Richards very well, and Sarah Weddington. And she really is the organizer of Hispanic women for feminism. And it's really because of her that this great deep value. She says, this is not a white thing, and just get out of my face. Anybody who's trying to say, well, you're just acting white. And she's like, no, this is how Hispanic women act. We care for our country. We care for our people. And don't tell us we can't get an education and we can't earn money. So she's fascinating character, and helps us to understand how feminism becomes a wide American value, not just something that's stuck on the Northeast among a group of educated white women. This is the Why We Care person, a woman named Yvonne Swan Wanro. She also is one of the few people in my book who's still living. She was charged and convicted of and sentenced to 20 years in prison for murder because a man who broke into the house she was in, where she was there with 2 other women and 8 children under the age of 8, maybe the oldest was 7. This was a man who was a known predator who had been questioned by the police, who had nabbed her son the day before and left a bruise on his shoulder before the boy got away, had reported this to the police. The police had said, it's Friday afternoon, we'll come back on Monday. And the man broke into the house, and she had a gun. And he came so close that when she lifted her gun, the muzzle of the gun met his shirt. Now, he was 6'2" and she was 5'4", and she was in a cast. Her lad had a broken leg, and she shot him, one shot, and killed him, and was sentenced to 20 years in prison. So her defense really becomes the basis for a rethinking of law, which rethinking of law was so important in the second wave of feminism. People like Ruth Bader Ginsburg played a huge role, and a number of women, including the women who were the attorneys for this woman, who said that in a physical contest between a man and a woman, you cannot say, well, what would a reasonable man do? Because that's how she was convicted. Well, a reasonable man would just put up his dukes if another man was coming at him. That's just foul play to draw a gun. So this was very interesting. It became the basis for what was later known as the battered women's defense. So Why We Care. And then my next chapter concerns another very important feminist who maybe 5 of you will recognize, maybe more, Phyllis Schlafly. And you're thinking, wait a minute. She really, I talk about Phyllis Schlafly because she really is what I call an anti-feminist feminist. And there were many. She just is a stunning recent example that some of you will recall. She's really, because of her, she's one of the primary movers behind the successful bid to stop the ratification of the Equal Rights Amendment, which sailed through Congress with no opposition by Republicans or Democrats. But she organized the opposition to it. And she's like other anti-feminist feminists, which I'll show you a couple of things to sort of show you that. People who said all the changes up to now, they're fine. They just seem like, duh, while of course women should be able to go to school, and oh, they should be able to speak, and oh, they should be able to lobby government, and why not give them the vote, and they can earn money, and they can wear pants. But don't let the clock go any farther forward. So Phyllis Schlafly said, I support the Equal Pay Act of 1963, the Equal Civil Rights Act of 1964, Ruth Bader Ginsburg's victories beginning in Reed versus Reed. But don't go any farther than that. And she's paired Why We Care with Muriel Siebert, who was the first woman to sit on the stock exchange, a Republican, by the way, Republican contender for the US Senate, fascinating and super funny woman. So back it in just so we're out of time there. But so it was an interesting, because in that chapter, it's a contest between two Republican women for the soul of the Republican Party. And you see, this is a comic from a Texas newspaper, I think it was, Ronald Reagan, who supported the Equal Rights Amendment, under pressure from Phyllis Schlafly, reversed his support and opposed the Equal Rights Amendment. And you see GOP women, he's trying to pour her a glass of wine, and she's like, I think I want that legal equality thing. So it was a real contest within Republicanism, and still is. What does it mean to be a member of the party? So anti-feminist feminism, just to back up, just to say, this goes back to the era of the American Revolution. This is one of the first comic send-ups of why feminists are so bad and stupid and neglectful. One of the things you can see, you can't quite see it, but there's a dog, under the table, and it's licking this baby. There's another version of this which has the dog urinating on the baby, and the women are just ignoring what's going on, and women are all, ugly and ugly feminists who neglect the family, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, this goes back to 1775, actually, even before Abigail Adams. This is an old graphic of Susan B. Anthony, and one of the things it showed was, oh my gosh, horrors. What happens if you give women the vote? And you probably can't see it very well, but on the right-hand side, it shows two men standing off to the side behind her. One of them is doing that incredibly scandalous thing of holding a baby, and the man next to her is actually buying groceries and carrying a grocery bag. This is what will happen if you give women the vote. The world will come into an end. Men will hold babies and maybe go shopping. To the left of Susan B. Anthony, a woman is, can you believe it? She's a police officer. Oh my gosh, the world is crashing down. And Susan B. Anthony herself has stolen Uncle Sam's hat. This is, again, much later. This is 40, 50 years later. And this is this woman who wants the vote. She's climbing this steps towards destruction. She goes from love, children, and marriage and home to such evils as a career and professional development, which leads to flattery. And I can hardly read this myself, but loneliness is at the top. So there's always been this mantra of feminism is this bad thing, but the things they fought for before now, well, that's pretty okay. But anything else is just a recipe for killing the family. And of course, today, 2 + 2 makes 4, only if you cling to the outmoded and stereotypical worldview of the patriarchy. This is a modern cartoon showing feminists are just these really ridiculous people. Ridiculous people, and yet they brought us these wonderful things that really we're so proud of in terms of our country. So the last chapter focuses on Beyonce. I will leave it to your imaginations as to what I say about her. Wonderful individual, real fighter for feminism. And then the Why We Care are people like Gretchen Carlson, Miss America 2.0, who brought down Roger Ailes for sexual harassment, and such women as the girls, the Olympic athletes. And so that chapter focuses on the right to safety. And so that's it. And I do believe I have one question. I see a hand up. Christine Hunefeld. If you unmute, I can hear your question. Or I guess I'm going to do the stop share, because then I can see the chat better. I have trouble when I'm doing okay, there you go. So fire away.
I don't know if I should be the first one, but let me open a couple of questions for you. The first one is to tell you that I'm coming from a reading of feminism and women's and family roles from the Amazon basin and from the Andean region. And what comes to my mind when I look at history is the Inca Empire, for instance, where you had a dual power, one by women and one by men. that were complementary. So there was no competition at all from the very beginning. And this is how the state was built up, no? And also the daily relationships. Then the second comment or question I have, what about the international influences on US feminism? I mean, when you mention John Locke, what immediately comes to my mind is Saint-Simon. And there were the Saint-Simonians in France, no, who had a very influential impact, not only in Europe, but also, I think, in the United States and in Latin America as well. And the kind of, one of your last slides, Elizabeth, shows journalism, the Times, right? So in general, I was wondering in how far journalism and the publications had an influence on what women did, what the women thought, and how things were divulgated, no, among other people, and how many could read it, no? I mean, alphabetism is an issue in place. And so, and I want to give you one little example from my own research from a book that is entitled Liberalism in the Bedroom. It's a 19th century reading in a country where you had indigenous people, where you had slaves, no, and you had slave women going to court and saying and questioning the whole system, asking the judges, how is it possible that the son or the daughter of a white man can be a slave? You mentioned the inheritance of slavery through the womb, no? And so there is also a kind of a daily feminism that is going on, no? That not only questions the position of women, but also the system itself, no? And I was yeah, okay.
No, since you've got 5 questions, I'll dip in, but they're wonderful, wonderful, thoughtful questions. And so without trying to answer all of them, one of the things I think, last thing you said, we talk about liberalism in the bedroom. And really, this is the spread of liberalism. I mean, what begins in the American Revolution, and it's not like we invented all the ideas. These ideas are almost come from Europe largely. I mean, as articulated, these sort of giant philosophy that the Saint-Simonians and all these Marx and all kinds of folks. But it's the idea that you put it into practice in government. The United States founds the first liberal Republican government, and just the fact that it happens and it stands is of great interest in many other parts of the world. And of course, Latin America, there's immediate, with the French Revolution, leads to republicanism throughout Latin America and the French Revolution, et cetera. So it's that idea that government can be of the people. And the United States does a lot because it becomes the first great experiment in that to put forward, to make those ideas practicable around the world. Doesn't mean we always do it the best by any means. In fact, there are, I think, 25 countries that outrank the United States today in terms of gender equality. But because it's this first experiment in republicanism, meaning liberalism, the government of the people, it helps to, first of all, then kind of kickstart the French Revolution, which is very much based, as one of the outcomes of the American Revolution is the French Revolution. Lafayette, when he writes up the Rights of Man, the great founding document of the French Revolution, Thomas Jefferson is sitting with him literally in the room at Lafayette's home, and is consulting with him on that document. And that helps to lead to great experiments in feminism, and also the first feminist martyr, Olympe de Gouges, who was guillotined for her feminism. And then also to Mary Wollstonecraft, who's writing in defense of the French Revolution, and that leads to her vindication of the rights of women. So these founding documents really come out of this larger movement towards liberty in general. And so, I'll sort of leave that at that. But I think you're right. There's everyday feminism, and that's where the sort of the why we care people come in. The people who say, "Wait a minute, why is it? If I'm a white woman impregnated by a free man of color, let's say, my child is not going to be enslaved, right? Because slavery follows the color of the mother, follows this enslaved status, not the status of the father, but of the mother. And so that was one of the ways in which feminism criticized slavery itself. So are there other questions? I thought I saw Mark Raymond had a hand up. Somebody had their hand up. Or Alvin?
Yeah, let me just say the general way to make it easier for people to ask questions is the raised hand method. So if people want to ask a question, if you click on the raised hand, which is in many cases sitting at the bottom of the screen, you'll see like a hand. If you click on that, then there'll be an order in which we'll see the order in which those questions are presented. So please feel free to do that right now.
And I just put up my hand so you can see what that looks like.
Exactly, there it is. And while people are figuring out how they're going to ask their questions, I can ask a question. So I'm an old white guy, and what I find recently, and I'm a strong supporter of women's rights, but what I find recently is that somehow the word feminism is changing from perspective of people like me. So the way it's changing is somehow or other the woke movement and the cancel culture and off with their heads in the academic world. You say the wrong word, even if the intention of saying it is to describe how bad a word it is. It doesn't matter. You've offended somebody, and so out they go. So that bothers me because I come from the academic world, and academic freedom and the ability to talk freely and comfortably without somebody saying, "Oh, you just offended me. Let's get him." And then they all rush the administration, which has such chicken heads, and so they'll overreact and fire the guy or do whatever they can do if they can. So it almost becomes then these types of things, which are extremists. I agree with you for the most part, I hope. Those types of things somehow besmirch what would ordinarily be feminism in the traditional sense that you're expressing it. And that's scary because it provokes a reaction. And the reaction is, oh my God, they're taking away things that I value. And it's their fault. And then there becomes the women's movement. And so the question is, how do you distinguish feminism as you're using it from these more extreme things, outbursts of youthful super exuberance, which is a little bit of know-nothingism?
Well, I think in the same way that we would none of us say, well, I don't believe in racism, but since there are some people who oppose racism, who are real loudmouths and are trying to oppress others, I guess I'll stop being against racism. Like, there would be as much sense as that as to say, well, I used to really support women's rights and the feminist movement, but now that there's some loudmouths who are trying to, harass and, create a mob mentality, I guess I can't support feminism anymore. It would be just as nonsensical. So my solution to that kind of problem is just to say, that means we all need to say we're feminists because we represent a real diversity of way of being in the world. A group like this represents that diversity. And, it's not like because some people give democracy a bad name, that I'm going to stop being a supporter of democracy. Or some people give the fight against racism a bad name or fight against sexism a bad name. I'm going to stop being that. No, it's just, it belongs to us. So we can give it away to people who are extremists, or we can say, no, these are middle American values. And in fact, Pew polls show that 91% of Americans call the equality between men and women very important. That's a higher number than actually support free elections. Believe it or not, free judiciary ranks number one, and then equality between the men and women ranks number two in terms of political priorities. And that's almost worldwide, by the way, not just Pew polls have on this. So I think that, yes, I'm really glad you brought up that issue. It's an issue. I think it's a different issue. And people who are trying to capture this sort of moral high ground, however they're defining it, and criticizing anybody else who just doesn't walk the way they walk. And that's not right, and it's anti-democratic. So we have another question from Sue Carberry. Is that right?
Yes, I come from the era of working in the trenches in the 70s in the feminist movement. I come from the era of having to debate the minions of Phyllis Schlafly and friends. I find it very difficult to swallow your naming of Phyllis Schlafly as a feminist, and you just touched on a couple of your reasons why. And I haven't read your book, but still, from what I remember from those days, I could not put her in that camp.
Well, she's, I think I find her awful in a variety of ways, but I mean, just the way she treated her gay son, that's enough to make me not a fan. But you have to understand, it is this curious thing. Phyllis Schlafly was the first Republican woman to really batter down the doors of the Republican Party. And she said, you just want us pouring coffee, and we're not going to just pour coffee anymore. You don't want women in the leadership, and we're not going to take that anymore. She said, you want us to be doing all the menial work. Those are her words, menial work in the party. We're not doing that anymore. She organized camps of women to teach them how to speak in public, how to debate. Now, by the way, the positions that they took are not ones that I support, but the idea that women deserved equal dignity, equality, and opportunity within the Republican Party was something that was a very near and dear to old Phyllis Schlafly's heart. So it's interesting, and I think her name is Karen DeCrow. I'm it's falling out of my brain now, some of these names, but president of NOW, she said, I always considered, Phyllis Schlafly a feminist. She's the kind of person I'd like my daughter to be, with a different set of politics. And of course, she's one of the organizers of the push of the Republican Party to the far right. Susan B. Anthony was a Republican when she voted illegally, for which she went on trial. The whole trial scene is a real fun part of my book, I think. She said, I voted the Republican ticket straight. That's what she wrote to Elizabeth Cady Stanton, for which she was found guilty. And Muriel Siebert was a Republican. Republican Party supported the Equal Rights Amendment before the Democratic Party. So the parties have been in this kind of interesting relationship with each other over time, alternately liberal and conservative. And I'm Sue. If you write me a note later, said I read the book and no, and but part of the point here is we don't have to be a fan of all of these people. I think there's this idea of, well, if she's not a nice woman, how can she be a feminist? And feminists must be bad because some of them aren't nice. And not everybody's nice. But
you're bringing up names of people that are coming back to me now in situations that I recall from the past. And it's and even the debate, particularly in the National Women's Political Caucus, how they kept striving to bring in the Republican women. And even at that time, I guess there was a branch of the party that might have been precursors of the Tea Party that evolved later on, that were very much anti what we were fighting for as feminists, and going back into limiting the rights that we were fighting for. And so we were trying to keep them involved at the time, but it seemed to be more and more difficult to keep the Republicans in that idea that the Democrats at the time were trying to enlarge and bring in more people and more rights. And the Republicans seemed to be closing those rights off.
And some Republicans, and they became dominant in the party, but some Republicans were not. Jill Ruckelshaus, you might remember as a name, a real staunch feminist of Republican, or Muriel Siebert, Nikki Siebert, who ran against Pat Moynihan, or she was to run against Pat Moynihan, but was defeated in their primary by an absolute unknown, simply on the issue of abortion, and which is probably the reason why they would have had a very liberal Republican senator from New York instead of Pat Moynihan, had that not happened within the Republican Party. Any other questions? Because I think we're out of time. I just thank you again so much for allowing me to share your afternoon, and I hope you'll take a look at the book and recommend it to friends. I learned a lot, and I've been studying history for a really long time, so maybe you will too.